Picture this. It is a November evening in 1534, and inside the private apartments of Hampton Court, a grown man, the most powerful ruler in England. A king who has just declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, defying the Pope and reshaping the nation's religion, is being undressed by other men. Not stripped in humiliation, but disrobed with ceremony, one garment at a time, by gentlemen of noble birth who compete for the honor of touching his linen shirt. Before he can even think of sleep, his bed will be searched with a dagger. His doors will be locked by a specific hand, in a specific order, following rules written down years earlier so that nothing is left to chance. Henry VIII cannot simply go to bed. Every candle, every cushion, every whispered "good night" is part of a machine designed to protect and glorify one man. And by the time the last flame is extinguished, you will understand that the King of England's nights were every bit as calculated as his days. If forgotten corners of history like this fascinate you, this is a good moment to hit like, because there is a lot more waiting just beneath the surface of 1534. To understand Henry's evenings, you first have to understand where he stood that year. He was 43 years old, still an imposing figure at over 6 feet tall, athletic in reputation though beginning to thicken around the waist from years of feasting and jousting. The devastating leg injury that would cripple him was still 2 years away. In 1534, Henry could still ride, still hunt, still dance, but the strain of kingship was visible. Earlier that year, the Act of Succession had forced Englishmen to swear loyalty to his marriage with Anne Boleyn over his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Thomas More, once his friend and Lord Chancellor, had been sent to the Tower for refusing that oath. By November, Parliament would pass the Act of Supremacy, formally naming Henry head of the Church in England. He was a king at war with the Pope, uncertain of foreign alliances, and haunted by the absence of a legitimate son. None of that pressure disappeared when the sun went down. If anything, the evening was when it caught up with him. His day did not end abruptly. Kings did not simply stop working. Late afternoon typically brought a final round of business, correspondence read aloud by secretaries, dispatches from ambassadors, perhaps a session with Thomas Cromwell, who by 1534 had become indispensable to Henry's government. Cromwell was overseeing the legal machinery of the Reformation itself, and evening conferences between king and minister were common, conducted in smaller, more private chambers than the formal presence chamber, where Henry received foreign dignitaries. These meetings could run long, particularly given how much legislation was moving through Parliament that year. Supper came earlier than modern audiences might expect, often between 5 and 6 in the evening, since Tudor households rose and dined by daylight rather than by clock. The king's principal meal had actually been dinner at mid-morning, a lavish, ceremonial affair. Supper was somewhat lighter, though lighter for Henry VIII still meant an extraordinary spread. Household accounts and ambassadorial reports describe roasted meats, beef, mutton, capon, sometimes venison from the royal parks, alongside bread and wine imported from France and the Rhineland. Henry was known to favor beef and had a hearty appetite. Later in life, this would contribute seriously to his health problems. But in 1534, he could still burn off much of what he consumed through physical activity. Anne Boleyn, now queen and visibly established at court following the birth of their daughter Elizabeth the previous September, would often have dined separately in her own chambers earlier, though the royal couple frequently came together in the evening for entertainment. That entertainment is where the picture of Henry becomes more vivid and, frankly, more human. He was an accomplished musician, composing songs, playing the lute and virginals, and singing. Ambassadors at court repeatedly commented on his musical talent. Evenings might include performances by court musicians, dancing, or card games, at which Henry was known to gamble, sometimes for considerable sums recorded in the privy purse expenses. Anne Boleyn, cultured and continentally educated from her years in the French court, shared many of these interests, and evenings together often involved music and conversation, rather than the stiff formality of daytime ceremony. Their relationship in 1534, while already showing strain over Henry's wandering attentions and the absence of a male heir, was still publicly affectionate. Whether Henry visited her chambers on any particular night is something historians generally cannot verify with certainty, but the royal couple maintained connected but separate apartments, a standard arrangement for English monarchs. As the evening advanced, the king's world contracted from the wide, public spaces of the palace into an increasingly private and tightly controlled sequence of rooms. This is where the household ordinances become essential to understanding Henry's routine. Rules, such as those established under the Eltham Ordinances of 1526, which laid out in remarkable detail exactly how the king's personal service should function. The Privy Chamber, the innermost suite of rooms, was staffed exclusively by gentlemen of high status, men Henry trusted and often genuinely liked. Chief among them was the Groom of the Stool, an office held in 1534 by Sir Henry Norris, a close confidant of the king. Despite the office's origin in managing the king's close stool, his private toilet, by Henry's reign it had evolved into one of the most powerful and intimate positions at court, granting daily physical proximity to the monarch, and with it, extraordinary political influence. Undressing the king was itself a ceremony. Gentlemen of the Privy Chamber removed his outer court garments, the doublet, the richly decorated gown, the hose, piece by piece in a fixed order, watched over by ushers who controlled who was permitted into the room. Beneath the finery, Henry wore a linen shirt, and for the night he would change into a separate nightshirt, often finer linen still, sometimes trimmed with embroidery. Over this he would wear a nightgown, not a garment resembling modern sleepwear, but a long, loose, fur-lined robe, since even a king's bedchamber could grow cold once the fire burned low. A nightcap covered his head, both for warmth and because Tudor gentlemen, following the fashions and hygiene concerns of the day, often kept their hair relatively short and their scalp covered at night. Washing before bed was simpler than modern audiences might assume. There was no nightly full bath. Bathing was an occasional luxury even for kings, requiring servants to haul and heat considerable quantities of water. Instead, Henry's grooms would have provided a basin of warm water scented with herbs for washing his hands, face, and feet, along with linen cloths for drying. Teeth were cleaned by rubbing with a cloth, sometimes with a mixture including sage or salt, since toothbrushes as we know them did not yet exist in England. Physicians, notably Dr. William Butts, who served as one of Henry's trusted royal doctors, kept a close watch on the king's health, and it is documented that Butts and other physicians were consulted regularly about diet, humoral balance, and general well-being, concerns that shaped what the king ate and how he was cared for in the evening hours. Before the king finally settled for the night, one more ceremony took place, and it is one of the more striking details to survive in the records, the voidie. This was a final light refreshment, typically spiced wine, hippocras, served with wafers, sweetmeats, or comfits, offered to the king and often to guests still present, before the room was formally voided of extra company. The voidie was both a practical nightcap and a small piece of theater, a final act of hospitality and status display before the private business of sleep began. If you are enjoying learning what actually happened behind the closed doors of Tudor royalty, consider subscribing, because this channel is committed to reconstructing history from genuine evidence rather than repeating popular myths. Now came the part of the routine most people never imagine: security. A king was never more vulnerable than while unconscious, and the Tudor court treated that vulnerability with total seriousness. Household ordinances specified that before the king retired, ushers and grooms were to search the chamber, checking behind tapestries, under furniture, and around the bed itself for anyone who might be concealed there. This was not paranoid theater. England in 1534 was a country undergoing religious upheaval, with real enemies of the king's new supremacy, some already imprisoned in the Tower. Once the search was complete, the doors were formally locked, and the keys were entrusted to a specific named officer, in keeping with strict protocol. A phrase along the lines of wishing the king good night was spoken as the final gentlemen withdrew, though not all of them left entirely. The king was rarely, if ever, truly alone. It was standard practice for a trusted groom or gentleman of the Privy Chamber to sleep on a pallet bed within or immediately outside the royal bedchamber itself. ready to respond instantly if the king required anything during the night. Beyond that inner room, yeomen of the guard would have been posted at intervals through the surrounding chambers and corridors, maintaining a human perimeter around the sleeping monarch that extended outward through the palace. The bed itself was a marvel by the standards of the age, a towering wooden frame hung with heavy curtains of velvet or richly worked fabric. Designed to be drawn closed around the mattress to trap warmth and block drafts, since large stone and timber palaces like Hampton Court could grow surprisingly cold even with roaring fires. The mattress rested on a feather bed, layered over a firmer under-mattress with linen sheets and blankets and pillows stuffed with down. Textiles bearing royal symbols, the Tudor rose, and by 1534 increasingly Anne Boleyn's own falcon badge, decorated hangings throughout the royal apartments, a constant visual reminder, even in private, of dynasty and authority. A fire would be banked low in the hearth rather than extinguished entirely, and beeswax candles, reserved for royalty and the wealthy while ordinary households made do with tallow, provided the soft, steady light historians associate with high-status Tudor interiors, their honeyed scent mixing with wood smoke and the herbs strewn on the floor. Sleep itself was not guaranteed to be peaceful. The political weight of 1534 did not vanish simply because the candles were low. Henry was a man anxiously awaiting a legitimate male heir, managing an increasingly complicated relationship with a wife whose position was not as secure as it appeared, and overseeing a religious break whose long-term consequences he could not fully predict. Contemporary accounts and later historical analysis suggest the king suffered periodically from insomnia and headaches during periods of political stress, though private. Undocumented details of any single night's rest are understandably lost to history. What we do know, through consistent household records, is that his physicians and closest attendants remained alert to any signs that the king was unwell, ready to be summoned at any hour. So tell me in the comments, which part of Henry VII's nightly ritual caught you most off guard, the armed search of his bedchamber, the ceremonial undressing, or the fact that a servant slept within arm's reach of the most powerful man in England? By the time Henry VIII finally drifted to sleep on any given night in 1534, an extraordinary apparatus of ceremony, hierarchy, and quiet vigilance had been set in motion around him, all to protect and elevate a single sleeping body. The gold thread in his bed hangings, the locked doors, the guards stationed through darkened corridors, the physician on call, the groom lying within reach on a pallet bed, none of it was excess for its own sake. It was the price of being untouchable and irreplaceable at the same time, a king whose safety and whose ability to produce an heir held the fate of a newly independent English church in the balance. Beneath the velvet and the candlelight, Henry VII's bedtime was not an escape from power. It was power's final, most carefully guarded performance of the day. If you want to keep exploring the hidden routines and forgotten realities of history's most powerful figures, there is another documentary waiting for you next. Go ahead and watch it now.